Okay, thank you everyone for coming to Girls Night Out with Jennifer Weiner.
Woohoo!
I'm Lauren Schiller, the host of Inflection Point from KALW and PRX, which is an independent production about women rising up, social change, and the quest for equality. So this is a great conversation for us to be having tonight. I will be trying to ask all the hard and infuriating questions. So, Mrs. Everything, 13th novel.
13th novel.
And already at the top of the New York Times bestseller list.
Well, it's actually number 2 behind the Crawdad book, but it's all good. It's all good. I'm joking that I'm going to have like a Crawdad boil and invite like every author who could have been number 1 but for the Crawdads. Our numbers are legion. Like seriously, like it's just the fucking Crawdad book. I don't know. Has anyone read it? Is it good? It's really good? I shouldn't be angry at the Crawd? Okay, all right, okay. I mean, because the author, it wasn't good right away, and then I've dated men like that. But it's a debut novel, and the author is like a 70-year-old woman, so like I can't really begrudge her that much. But yes, but thank you.
I worked at a restaurant called Crawdads.
Seriously?
I did. And you want to know what the motto was?
No.
You
what?
Don't? Does anyone else?
Yeah. What was it?
Suck the heads, eat the tails.
Okay.
I still can't feel my middle toe from the high heels I had to wear as a hostess. And that was like 25 years ago. Anyway.
Anywho.
Okay, Mrs. Everything.
Yes.
It is, it's an authentic, beautifully written story about 2 sisters, and it spans from the time they were kids in 1951 to the night of the 2016 presidential election.
Yes.
You know the one?
Yes.
And it does take a little foray into 2022.
Yes, so. I skipped over the bad part. Just kind of, we go from like the silvery balloons cascading from the ceiling and the character looking at the television set and thinking everything is going to be better in the world that she's leaving her daughters and her granddaughters. And then we skip to 2022 because I couldn't handle the in-between. Yeah. I couldn't.
And it was it's very serene and apolitical in 2022 in your book.
Yes.
So your book is getting rave reviews across the board, and I am thrilled to be here with you to talk about it.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here too.
Yay. Yay. And Jen will be taking questions at the end, so if you think of them, hold them. And I don't know, with the way this night is going, you might as well just throw them out.
Just yell.
Okay. So, Jen.
Yes.
Why was now the time for you to write this book?
Well, it wasn't the book that I set out to write. I wrote Hungry Heart, my memoir, and I, voted in 2016 with my daughters in the polling booth with me, completely believing that we would have our first female president, and I didn't even wake up the next morning. I think I stayed up all night. I was watching the returns, and I just couldn't believe it and couldn't believe it and couldn't believe it. And after the election, as someone who writes lighthearted, breezy, beachy. I mean, definitely my books deal with issues, and they have some substance, and they have some heft. But, I write entertaining novels, entertaining fiction. I make shit up. And after the election, I was thinking, like, what do I do? Like, what does the world require of me at this moment? Like, do I write essays? Do I write political stuff? What do I do? And what I decided I needed to do was to write a dark dystopian set in the near future in a world where abortion and contraception were legal and you could go to jail for seeking them out. In other words, Georgia. It wasn't Georgia yet, but it just turned into Georgia very quickly. And so I set out to write this book that I was going to call The Believers, and it was there was a woman on each side of the abortion debate. There was an anti-abortion activist who was trying to figure out what to do with herself now that she had achieved her life's aim, and a Planned Parenthood nurse practitioner who was continuing to provide women with health care in defiance of the law. And I worked and I worked and I worked, and I wrote and I wrote and I wrote, and I must have thrown out hundreds of pages. I just could not make it work. And I think that in retrospect, the novelist Hayari Jones talks about novels have to be about people, not problems, right? And I think that that was a book that was about a problem and the people were secondary, and I think that you could really feel that on every page. So I put it aside, and I was thinking, what do I do now? And in the back of my head, I'd always had this desire to write a big, sweeping, historical novel, something that spanned not just one woman's life, but, you know, generations, really. Susan Isaacs is one of the novelists I love, and she wrote this book called Almost Paradise. That's one of my favorite books of all time, and it's about this couple, this marriage, but you meet the wife's parents and the wife's grandparents and the husband's parents and the husband's grandparents, and you see all of the forces in their family and in their history and in the country's history that has made them who they are, right? I wanted to write that kind of book. And I wanted it to be my mother's story, a version of my mother's story. So my mom, Fran, as some of you guys might know if you've read Good in Bed or you've followed me on social media, my mom grew up in Detroit in the 1950s, went to the University of Michigan in the 1960s, married a man, as you did back then, and moved to the suburbs of Connecticut, had 4 children. I'm the oldest. My dad left in the 80s, sort of decided he didn't want to be a father anymore, didn't want to be a husband anymore, just, see you bye. He told us we could think of him as a fun uncle, which I just thought was so abhorrent and weird. So he left, and 10 years go by, and I'm sitting at my desk at the Philadelphia Inquirer, where I'm a reporter, and the phone rings, and it's my brother Joe, the youngest of the 4 of us. And Joe says, "Jenny, there's a woman living in the house." And I'm like, "What do you mean?" And Joe begins to present his evidence. He says there's shoes, and they're a woman's shoes, and they're not Fran's shoes. And there's clothes, and they're women's clothes, and they're not Fran's clothes. And then I went into Mom's bathroom because I needed toenail clippers, and I found all of these love letters signed Karen. So I'm like, huh. So the first thing I do is I send Joe some toenail clippers, because all of this could have been avoided had Joe but had toenail clippers. And then I call my mom. And I say, "Hey, what's new?" And she says nothing. And I say, nothing going on, nothing you want to tell me. And she says no. And I said, "Joe says there's a woman living in the house." And there's this pause. And then my mom says, "Oh, that's Karen. She's my swim coach." All right, Fran is not an Olympic swimmer, you guys. So I'm just like, what is going on here? And she says, "Okay, Karen is the aquatics director of the West Hartford JCC, and she asked me on a date, and we went on 2 dates, and we're in love, and she moved in. Bye." And I'm sitting there with the phone in my hand thinking, what just happened, right? Because I had never had occasion to think of my mom as anything but straight. That was the default setting of moms that I knew. And I was, it was the 90s, and it was different then. Like, Matthew Shepard had been murdered not too long ago. Ellen had just come out on that cover of Time magazine, the "Yep, I'm Gay" cover, and she'd lost her sitcom. It was a different time to be gay, and I was startled and confused and upset, and I didn't know what this meant. Why had she married my father? Had she wanted to be married to a man? Had she wanted to have children? Like, what was this all about? And I think that, as is often the case with me and many other people, my confusion and my upset manifested itself as humor. Right? So I wrote Good in Bed, and I put in a character based on my mom, the sort of like fresh out of the closet 54-year-old. And that character was like very much a punchline. Like, she was there for comic relief. And as the years went on, and I wrote more books, and I became a mother, matured a little, I hope, I would think about that character, like the Fran character, like the woman who knew that there was a part of herself that she could not share with the world, that she couldn't be honest about for many, many years, and started to really think, like, what must that have been like for her? And so that was a story that I always wanted to tell. But I was hesitant to do it because I thought, like, okay, if I write about my mom, and I know I'm going to give the character a sister because I'm interested in sisters, and that's going to let me sort of talk about women's roles and the different paths that women can take, is that story big enough, right? Like, is that going to say the things that I want to say at this moment in America right now? And it was so interesting because, like, here I am, like, I'm a feminist, okay? Like, I have always been a feminist, and I have always been very vocal about women's stories mattering and deserving all of the attention and all of the regard and all of the respect that men's stories do. And yet I'm sitting here thinking, it's just a sister story, right? Like, I had to really, like, push back hard at that, all of that bias I'd swallowed. And I had to remember this quote that I've always loved from the novelist Grace Paley, who in the 70s was asked, do you consider your novels political? And what she said to the person interviewing her was, I write about women's lives, so yes. Right? The personal is political, and women's stories have power. And I think that women's stories are necessary, perhaps now more than any time in our history. And I decided, I'm going to tell this story as honestly as I can. I mean, it's fiction, yes, but I'm going to do the research, I'm going to do my homework, I'm going to really try to talk about what it was like to be a woman in the 50s, in the 60s, in the 70s, in the 80s, all of the things you couldn't do, all of the choices that weren't available, all the doors that were closed, all the paths that were sort of roped off. And I am going to believe in the power of that story as much as I can. And that's Mrs. Everything. That was what, you know, that became the book. So that's where it came from. Long answer, sorry.
Did you ask your mom those questions?
Oh, I sure did. Yeah.
And was she open to Aunt talking?
Oh, she was not. No. I mean, so basically every family in my house, every holiday in my family goes like this, okay? Like Passover, Thanksgiving, whatever it is, we cook the meal, we eat the meal, we do the dishes, we put the food away, we go into the living room, and we grill my mother about her sexuality, right? I'm like, so Fran, when did the urges start? And she's like, I'm not telling you this. And I'm like, okay, you know.
Is this like all four of you sitting in front of
pretty
her asking
much,
these
yeah,
questions?
Pretty much.
Shocking that she wasn't just forthcoming.
Well, you know, she always told me it was all material,
right.
You know, but mostly it's like me and my sisters. Like my brothers sort of want no part of it, perhaps unsurprisingly. But as I was writing the book, like I would say, like, what did your elementary school look like? Or what did you wear to school? Or what was your library like? Or, you know, we went to Detroit. She showed me the house she grew up in. She showed me her elementary school and her library and her high school. And every once in a while she'd be like, Jenny, why are you asking me this? And I'd be like, oh, no reason, you know. And eventually I'm like, I'm writing a book that's set in Detroit in the time when you grew up. She's like, what is this book about? Like, sisters. You know, but I mean, I obviously I had to let her read it eventually, and she did. And she said, I'm just going to tell everyone my daughter has a very good imagination. So I'm like, okay, Fran, you go with God. If it works for you.
Well, let's talk about the sisters in the book. So
yes.
they're named Jo and Bethy, and Jo is essentially your mom.
Jo is Fran. Jo is my version of Fran. Like, I shouldn't say she's Fran. She's my imagining of a Fran-esque character.
Okay, and Bethy is her younger sister.
Bethy is the good girl. Bethy is the one who follows the rules and conforms to society's expectations of what girls should be and what they should wear and what they should be interested in, what they should want. She's the good girl.
Is she based on a real person as well?
Well, my mom has a sister, my Aunt Marlene, who, you know, we all joke is sort of the thin, blonde, married, heterosexual one. And Fran, none of those things anymore. But my Aunt Marlene, I mean, I don't know as much about her life as my mother's, but she married her summer camp sweetheart when she was 19. She had her first baby the year later, got a degree from the University of Michigan, and had a baby all the same year. She's 4 kids, married to the same man. So I would say that her life certainly looks more conventional than my mom's does. But, you know, what happens in this book is, like, I've set up these sort of two archetypes, right? The rule follower and the rule breaker, the tomboy and the good girl. And they sort of swap places at certain points in the book, where the character you think is heading for this sort of unconventional bohemian life ends up married in the burbs. And the character that you think is going to end up married in the burbs ends up in a commune in Georgia doing a rebirthing through a pillow fort vagina. So, you know, it splinters in bad places. But, you know, and they both sort of end up suffering in certain ways. And one of the people that I was doing one of these events with said, you know, what were you trying to say by sort of having these terrible things happen to both of them and sort of putting them through the ringer? And I said, you know, really simply, I wanted to say that no matter what path we as women take, no one gets out unscathed. No one gets out unharmed. The odds are stacked, and they are never in our favor. And the world hurts women, no matter what. Like, there's no way to, quote unquote, do it right. You know, and whether you're a whistleblower or you're somebody who pushes back immediately, whether you try to conform or you try to resist, it seems you get hurt.
Yeah, well, what I also thought was interesting is the way they talk about each other.
Yes.
So they each have very strong opinions about the other and where
yes.
the other is coming from, and they're sort of unreliable narrators.
Right.
So Joe says Bethy is a genius for conformity who played at being a rebel, and then Bethy says that Joe is still in chains.
Yes. And each, you know, each of the sisters has ideas about how they're going to liberate the other one, or how they're going to set her on the right path because they know better, which I think is a familiar dynamic among sisters. But, you know, they each have things the other wants, and it was interesting to sort of play with those ideas. You know, and just there was so much I wanted to talk about. I mean, I wanted to talk about sexuality. I wanted to talk about body image. I wanted to talk about women's relationship to food. I wanted to talk about ambition. I wanted to talk about children, and do you have them? Do you not have them? I wanted to talk about the work-life balance and how women always get asked that question and men do not. The how do you balance work and family, right? Like, I remember, like, Tina Fey and Will Ferrell were in a movie together, right? And they had each had children right about at the same point. I mean, Will Ferrell's wife had had a baby, and Tina Fey had had a baby. And I just remember, I don't remember what movie this was that they were doing publicity for, or maybe it was they each had separate movies at the same time. But every single interview with Tina Fey, how are you balancing work and family? Is it hard for you to leave your baby and go on set? Do you miss your baby? Who's taking care of that baby? You know, is it terrible for you to be away from that baby? And I watched, and no one asked Will Ferrell, do you miss that baby? Who is caring for that baby? You terrible parent for being away from that baby. Because that's the subtext, right? Like, you've done something wrong, Mom. There was just so much I wanted to talk about and so much I wanted to say. So the sisters were vehicles for that. But I hope they feel like people, not vehicles. I want them to sort of like live and breathe on the page.
Yeah, they definitely feel like people. They do not feel like vehicles, but a lot of shit happens to them.
Shit happens. Shit goes down.
But it made me wonder, we sort of don't want to spoil the things that happen in the book, right? But a lot does happen, and a lot of, I'll put it in quotes, choices are made and directions are gone that are not actually choices. They're sort of driven to because of the society that they live in the decades that they're living in.
Right.
And the question that it made me ask is, you know, as we think of ourselves as beings with free will and agency to the best that we can have it, that who is really making women's choices? Right? Are we making our own choices?
No, man,
it's the
patriarchy. It's the patriarchy. Right? Isn't it? Hashtag patriarchy. But, you know, yes.
Yeah. That was the conclusion I came to after reading the book. And then you look at yourself.
To give just one example, okay, Bethy encounters a handsy coworker, right? And then 50 years later, Bethy's niece encounters a handsy coworker. And it's the same, what do I do? Who do I tell? He's my boss. How hard do I push back at this? Do I just kind of like laugh and go along with it? Is there a way to make him accountable for his actions? What do I do if he goes after another woman in the office? Is that my responsibility? Like, some things have changed. Like, I don't want to say that there has been no progress, because there has been progress. But when I think about that issue in particular, and when, you know, obviously today the thing I'm thinking about is E. Jean Carroll's story, right? And you guys have all seen it, I'm sure, where she has alleged that Donald Trump raped her, that he raped her in the dressing room of Bergdorf's, which is a very fancy New York City department store. The details sound, to me, extremely credible. She has corroborating witnesses. She told 2 girlfriends. They both confirmed that, yes, she said this happened. And I mean, I don't even know where to start with how angry I am about this, about the fact that the president is just like, whatever, I never met this woman. Well, by the way, the story ran with a photograph of the 2 of them together, right? I mean, maybe she didn't make a big impression on him, but they had met. And, you know, this, in any other world except the world that we are in right now, which is, as far as I'm concerned, we are on the worst timeline, right? Like, somehow we just slipped and we're on the worst timeline. But, like, responsible, respected, credible, white, privileged journalist alleges she's been raped by the president. Front page news, right? Not front page news. I mean, the New York Times covered this in the book section. In the book section. And like, I want to see more women in the book section, but not like that, right? Yes. I mean, it's you know, in any other world, it's like, holy shit, someone says the president raped her. In this world, it's Tuesday. And you know, I have daughters, right? And I think that, like, that is one of the things that has me so worked up about this. I have daughters. My older daughter is 16. She's going to be a junior in high school. In 2 years, she is going to college, God willing. There may be a gap here. I don't know. What is the world I am sending her into? And I talk to her and my younger daughter, and I say, make sure your friends know where you are. Do not put your drink down at a party. Do not get in a car with a strange boy. If you're taking an Uber, you look at the license plate and you ask the driver who he's there to pick up. My friends with sons don't have to do any of this, right? If you're walking and it's dark, don't have your earbuds in, right? Just the 1,000 tiny things, the armor that we have to put on to go out into the world. You know, and again, these are as privileged white women, right? I mean, it is worse in other communities. And I have marched. I marched in college. I've marched. I went to the Women's March. I march, I give money, I volunteer, I sign petitions, I vote, I canvass, I knock on those doors. I don't know what else to do. And I want to ask you guys, like, honestly, if anyone can think of anything else to do to fix this, other than, like, speak up about it. Because I feel, and I'm sure many of you will share this feeling, like we're banging our heads against a wall and nothing is changing. And I feel helpless and I feel angry, and it's not just this tippy chair. It's, you know, like, what do we do? What do we do, Lauren? What do we do?
I wish I had the answer. I mean, I'm always the silver lining person, right? I mean, her story, I mean, not to discount anything that you just said. But I actually just attended an event the other night that was a pro-abortion event. Mm-hmm. They were trying to raise money to support in the states where it's become, you know, basically about to be illegal.
Right.
And someone got up and said, you know what, we actually have made more progress than we've slipped backwards. And so when I look at what you document in the book, essentially what these women have gone through, I mean, we are actually better off than we were in the 50s. For example,
Yes.
women can have credit cards.
Women can have credit cards.
Without a husband.
Hallelujah.
Right? I mean, access to credit is something.
Access to credit. We can buy houses. We're allowed to get our tubes tied without our husband's permission. Like, that did not used to be the case. Like, if you hadn't had any children, you couldn't get your tubes tied. If the doctor decided you hadn't had enough children, couldn't get your tubes tied. If your husband did not okay it, couldn't get your tubes tied. I mean, talk about not having agency over your own body. And we have made gains, and that is for sure. But I feel, and I'm sure many of you guys do too, that these gains are under attack, and they are tenuous, and they are shaky, and it's very strange for me. It's a little like whiplashy, right? Because I live in Philadelphia, okay? And it does not get much bluer than Philadelphia. Like, it is, I mean...
Maybe Berkeley.
Maybe Berkeley, right. I shouldn't say that, yes. Okay, I feel the blue. I feel the blue. But, like, you know, my kids' schools have gender-neutral restrooms. And when my daughter brings friends home, she says, you know, this is Auden, and Auden's pronouns are they, them. And takes it for granted that her friends are gay, bisexual, genderqueer, gender fluid, trans. Like, she knows all. She has friends who have two moms. She has friends who have two dads. She has a friend who's, you know, single mom by choice, who went to a sperm bank. Like, their normal is very different than my normal was. But that's our little blue enclave, and that is not the world. And, you know, every newspaper, every day, it seems, will run some, like, we went and talked to Trump voters in a diner, right? And I am the person who keeps reading those stories, right? Because I really want to know, like, how can you support what he says, and how can you believe what he believes? And the most convincing argument I've read, I don't know if any of you guys read Arlie Hochchild's. It was a piece in The Atlantic that was expanded to a book, and she talks about line jumpers.
Strangers in their own land.
Yes, yeah. Exactly. She sort of embedded herself in a very right-wing community in Louisiana. Like, she was writing about the Tea Party, which sort of morphed into the Trumpy people. And she talked about line cutters, right? Where there are people, you know, white people, male people, who used to have privilege, lots and lots of privilege. And now they believe that there are people who are jumping the line. They're getting welfare benefits, or they're illegal immigrants and they're getting special treatment, or, you know, they are black kids who got into Harvard just because they're black and some deserving white kid didn't get in, and what a shame. People who are jumping the line and taking things that don't belong to them. And I read something that, like, you know, when you are oppressed and making progress, it feels to you like climbing. When you are on top and seeing other people coming to meet you, that feels like falling. And I think that there are people in America who truly believe that they are losing ground, they're losing status, they're losing privilege, they are losing, you know, the default setting. That, you know, everybody assumes that, you know, if you're a man, you know, you can be anything. And, you know, if somebody says my doctor, you in your head will picture a man, or my professor, and you will picture a man. And that's becoming no longer true. There are more women graduating from medical school than men. There are more women graduating from law school than men. You know, the Ivy League is becoming more diverse, and slowly but surely so are major corporations. And to us it looks like progress, and to them it looks like falling. And that was her argument, and that's what I have found the most convincing explanation. Like, I read this one article, and it was, you know, the Trump voters angry about whatever had happened, and they interviewed somebody who said, you know, so-and-so, you know, a staunch Trump supporter is unemployed while he is waiting for, you know, the Marines to pay off his medical claim or something. He'd been discharged as a Marine. He'd been hurt. He was waiting for his money to come through. And then I read 3 paragraphs about this man railing about what the government is doing for other people, other undeserving people, while he is waiting for his check from the government. And I'm like, do you not see, you know, like, I mean, yes, you know, he had served his country, he'd been hurt, but, like, the idea that, like, the benefits are just for a certain class of people, and the rights and the privileges are just for a certain class of people. And that, I think the Obama years challenged that. I think there was a lot of change real quick with gay marriage and the, the increased acceptance and transgender stuff, and and now I think is the pushback, the pendulum swinging the other way.
Well, fortunately, the pendulum swings.
That's yes,
right.
Yes,
I mean, as long as it
yes.
doesn't lock into place,
right? I mean, but like, it's a crappy time to live through. But you're right, because that's what I learned in researching this book, is that progress is not a straight line. Progress is sort of incremental, up, down, back, forth, back, forth. And I guess it feels hard, having made these gains and having made these strides, to now see them all under attack again. Or like with abortion rights, like, my mom marched, I marched, my kids have marched, their kids will probably march. Like, I don't know.
Right. Well, you said to me on the phone when we were preparing for this that you could just dust off your signs from when you were marching 10 years ago.
We won't go back sign with the coat hanger with a slash through it and just hand it to Lucy and send her off to college. Like, that doesn't feel good to me.
Well, I mean, that brings up one of your main, I don't know, call it your mission, but the telling women's stories and having these stories out here and having the perspective, the female perspective, which is different from a male perspective.
Yeah.
And sharing it with as many people as possible is so important.
Right. I mean, this book is fiction, right? But I think that you can be honest in fiction. You can tell truths in fiction. And that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to say, this is what it was like if you had to live in the closet. This is what it was like if you chose not to have kids and had to spend a lot of time defending that decision and almost defending your status as a woman. This is what it's like to have a boss who abuses you. This is what it's like to have a relative who abuses you. This is what it's like to have your own female family enforcing society's vision of the feminine and imposing it on you. This is what it's like. And I believe in the power of stories, and I believe in the power of language, and I believe in the power of naming things, right? I think if you can't name a problem, you can't solve it. And there's a scene in the book where one of the characters is molested by a relative, right? And she tries to tell her mother what's going on. And all she can come up with to say is, Uncle so-and-so is hugging me too long. She doesn't have the words for what's happening or how it makes her feel, or even like what body parts are being hugged too long, really. And her mother, who's been widowed, who's trying to support this family, who's being pulled in a million different directions, brushes her off and says, what are you talking about? That doesn't sound like much to me. And it's not until her sister comes back from summer camp and is able to sort of suss out what's really going on and to rescue her. I mean, we didn't have words for so much of this. Like, marital rape was pretty much an oxymoron until 1983 when the courts finally made it illegal. Like, marital rape wasn't a thing. If you were married, you got to have sex with your wife whenever you wanted to. That's what marriage was. And I think that having the words allowed us to pull that problem out in the open. So I believe in the power of stories. I believe in the power of language. I believe in the power of radical honesty and speaking truth to power, and all of us telling our stories, even when it's hard. Like, to go back to E. Jean Carroll, like, I'm watching the blowback that she's getting, right? And even the people who are like, well, I believe women, but she does have a book out now, and maybe she's just doing this to sell books, right? And I'm like, okay, let me tell you, as somebody who is on a book tour trying to sell books, that is not how you're gonna get your sales up, by like making a false rape allegation. Like, show me the woman who has ever gotten rich or famous by accusing someone of rape. That's not what happens. That is 100% not what happens. You lose your job, you become a punchline, your name gets dragged through the mud. I mean, there, I'm sure, are people right now combing through every minute of this woman's history and trying to find men who are like, oh, she'd get drunk at parties and she got wild, and somebody's like, oh, she flirted with him once, she must have wanted it. Like, that's what we do to women who tell the truth like that. And there's, you know, why didn't she come forward sooner? Well, let's think about what happens to women who come forward. Like, do we believe them automatically? Do the crimes get redressed automatically? You know, I had a friend in college who was raped by a guy that she had dated, and she did the right thing. She reported it, went to the campus health center, went to the school's authorities, not the police. I think that the school handled it internally. And what the school decided to do after careful consideration and lengthy deliberation was to put this guy in a different dorm. And this was 1990, I think. And, you know, are things different now? Like, if she'd gone to the police instead of to the school, would things be different? If she hadn't dated him, would things be different? If it had been a stranger who jumped out of the bushes instead of a guy she invited into her room, would it have been different? You know, it just seems like we're not where we need to be yet in terms of believing women, in terms of what happens to men, in terms of what we do with these guys once they've been quote unquote canceled, because it sure seems that nobody's getting canceled forever. Like, they're all kind of creeping back. So what do we do? Like, is there a way for, you know, can they learn to do better? Can they make recompense? Can they fix the damage they've done? How? What does it look like? I don't know, but I think we have to, you know, the more that we talk about it and the more that we tell our stories, I think the closer we're going to get to some kind of solution.
Yeah. Well, one of the conversations that I just had last week was with Eve Ensler, who's asking men to make an apology, like a serious year-long reckoning with what they've done kind of apology. And that we have to be able to hear it.
Wow. That's interesting, because women say they're sorry all the time, right? Like, I mean, and if right, and if you call somebody out on it, you know, like, hey, quit apologizing. Oh God, I'm sorry, right? I mean, I don't think men are socialized to say they're sorry, and I think a lot of the apologies are like, well, I'm sorry if you felt some kind of way. Which is not an apology, right? That's placing the blame on the person who's feeling some kind of way, right? Like, wow. They just have to apologize for a year?
Well,
I'm kind of into it. I'm kind of into it. Wait,
well, it's kind of
let's play this out.
It's kind of a restorative justice approach.
I am all about restorative justice.
Acknowledge what they've done.
Yes.
And never, ever do it again.
Can they make reparations?
Yeah.
Financial?
They can do it any which way.
Well,
that is going to make a difference, I guess.
Because I think that there are men who want to be allies and just don't know what to do.
Right.
And, you know, I mean, you had talked before about the guys who came to the Eve Ensler thing and how you thanked them for being there, and how there was a woman who said, hey, don't give them cookies.
Well, that was a different event, actually. That was Rebecca Traister.
Oh, Rebecca Traister, yeah. Sorry. I get my angry women confused. No, but.
See, I didn't thank the men for coming tonight, but I'm glad you're here.
As one of them myself, I can say that. But, you know, like, the idea, like, I would feel inclined to say to a man who came to a Rebecca Traister event, thank you for being here, thank you for listening. However, I can also hear the woman saying, hey, let's not give them pats on the head for doing the minimum. So I don't know what the answer is.
Well, this brings us to another conversation, which is women read women and women read men.
Yes.
But men read men.
Men read men.
So
if they read at all, okay?
Well, what is that about? I mean, what is that about?
Well, okay.
Do you have a theory?
I do.
Okay.
I do. It has to do with empathy. Like, okay, I have daughters, said that already. They loved Harry Potter. I know many boys who loved Harry Potter. Would they have loved Harry Potter if Harry was Annie Potter? My daughters read all the Percy Jackson, all of those books. which are about boys. I mean, there's girls in them, but the boys are the main characters. And boys read those books, but I don't know if boys aren't socialized to read books about girls, or books with girls as the stars, right? So then, I think that our ideas of like who matters in a story and what is literature, like all of that is shaped when we're children, when we're in high school, when we're reading the canon and there's like 3 women and 300 men. And I just, for whatever reason, not many men read fiction. I don't really know why that is. Not many men read fiction, and when they do, it tends to be fiction written by a man. And I mean, my daughters came to the first reading that I did for this book, which was in Princeton, New Jersey. I asked if they wanted to go. I was expecting to hear, the usual like eye rolls and no. But they said, yes, Mom, which made me think they're up to something. There's going to be an ask at the end of this. And, we do the event, and I do the thing where I ask everyone to hold their books up so I can take a picture, and everybody holds their book up, their copy of Mrs. Everything, except my daughter Lucy, who holds up her copy of Falsettos, which is yellow, which is not the right color. And I'm like, why are you doing this? Why do you hate me? And then so she's all like 16, and she's got to be like super duper cool and cynical, and she's like, ugh, Mom, all of your readers are middle-aged white women. And I'm like, okay, let's back that up. Let's back that up. What do you think I am, for starters? What do you think you will be, second? And who do you think reads pretty much anything? It's women. It's women. And it's black women, actually, who are proportionately the largest consumers of fiction. But it's women. It's not men. I don't know why. And when they read fiction, it's fiction by men, and it is coded so carefully, right? Like, if you're a woman and you write a book and you want that book to be considered literature, i.e., you want male readers, you have to have a cover, right? You cannot have a whisper of lady stuff, okay? No female figures, right? No things that read as female, like, no oceans, no beaches, no clothing, no like laundry on a line. There were lots of books that had laundry on a line on the cover for a while. Like Meg Wolitzer, who I love, right? Her books are about women and families and romance and jobs and stuff, all the stuff. But the covers don't ever have female figures. They're like these sort of neon rainbowy things on it. And, it's, I was going to say something else about covers. What was it? It'll come back in a minute. It will. But it's like you can't have women on covers and ever expect that men will read that book. And I don't know.
What do you want to ask the guys in the audience to do when they go home tonight?
Read women. Read books by women. I mean, and hold them out in public. Be loud and proud. Be like, yes, I am reading. Whatever.
I mean, reading Mrs. Everything, I have to say, mm-hmm. if I was a man, mm-hmm. would be very enlightening.
Right. Yeah. I think that there's a lot to be learned. I mean, I read books by men, and I learn a lot of things, how men think and what they want and how they feel about stuff. And I think that men could be similarly enlightened if they were interested. But I feel like there's bias, right? Like they're almost told not to. Like, this isn't serious work, right? This is not improving. This is not going to teach you anything. It's just a book about feelings, right? And when a guy writes a book about a family, it's hailed for its emotional brilliance and its sensitivity and its range and its reach. And if a woman writes a book about a family, it's called domestic. And lapidary, which is a fancy word for small, and jewel-like, and I mean, forget it. Like, men won't read it, which kind of, I mean, from a marketing perspective, doesn't really matter. Like, I can tell you that my publishers are not tying themselves in knots to get men to read my books because they sell real well with just women, right? So it's like, what do they want to put a gun on the cover and hope that guys will buy it? I mean, they don't, but it's an interesting thing to me I have more to say about it, but I'm like so fried. I can't think of it. I'm like 50% hairspray and like foundation at this point. Like, I don't even know.
Well, let's do a time check. How much time do we have?
How are we doing? Questions.
Oh, questions.
Questions.
Okay, I have one question that I have to ask you.
Ask me.
There are some seriously graphic sex scenes
Jesus.
in this book.
Oh,
I
God,
know,
we
you're
have
not
to
getting
talk
out of the
about
room
them.
without it.
Oh,
I read the book. I don't
man.
know if everyone else has read the book. How does anyone write a sex scene?
They're
How
not
do you
easy.
write a sex? Okay.
They're not easy. I was going to say hard, but that would have been a pun. All right. So, how do you write a sex scene? I mean, well, I think the first question is, why do you write a sex scene? Okay. Because they're not easy to do, and it would be a lot easier to, like Stan and Lacey gazed passionately into each other's eyes. Their lips met as the world blurred around them, and then the next morning, like Stan and Lacey are having eggs together at the breakfast table, and you've just sort of like jumped ahead. But you can't do that, and the reason you can't do that is because sex is a thing that people do, and it shows you who they are. Like, Curtis Sittenfeld, the novelist, is a friend of mine, and she says, like, you have to write sex scenes because, like, that's one of the places where people are the most who they are, is in bed, right? So perhaps the question then is, how did I write lesbian sex scenes that are sort of like imagining my own mother's sex life?
That is my question.
Right? So I don't know. Like, I think I'm a giant weirdo, basically. But, I mean, the other thing is, like, I read a lot of Jackie Collins, I read a lot of Judith Krantz, I read a lot of Susan Isaacs, and those books had some pretty scorching sex scenes, let's be real. So, and I will tell you something else. Women had orgasms in those books. Like, right? Well-described, orgasms. And I learned about pleasure and what I could expect when I began to have sex many, many years later. I was a huge nerd. But when I started having sex, I was just like, I'm going to have an orgasm because I read Shirley Conran's Lace, and I know that I should, right? So I feel responsible to the future, right? To the girls of tomorrow. I read the sex scenes. Yes. Yes. Because like books are where we learn who we are, right? And who we're going to be. And I want, the women of the future to feel very entitled to their orgasms. I think we should go home now. I'm not going to say anything better than that tonight. So
I want to go back and see if Forever has an orgasm. Does anyone remember Judy Blume? Because that was very informative.
It was consensual. That I can tell you. She was into it. And I think that she had orgasms masturbating, but maybe not with the guy. Anyone read Yes? Am I right? I'm right.
Okay.
Yeah. Not that I read Forever obsessively.
But we digress. So you just used your imagination to make the lesbian sex scenes?
Yes, I did.
I also felt very informed by your book. That standpoint.
I'm glad.
You and Judy Blume.
This is why I'm here. Listen, your pleasure is my business. That did not sound right. That sounded wrong.
TM.
That sounded very wrong. Very wrong. All right, what else you got? Should we ask
Let's
people?
Open it up.
Do people want to know things?
Do we want to take a mic out?
Or you can just yell. It's we're a small intimate crowd. Oh. We're recording. Okay, I forgot about that.
We got technology.
Probably tone down the cursing.
Who wants to go first? Raise your hand. All right.
Yes, right there.
So I'm wondering if you could just expand on the topic of men's literature versus women's, and men being recognized for literary prizes. I think you wrote a New York Times op-ed about that.
One or two.
Yes. Yeah, Jonathan
right.
Franzen.
Yeah.
Okay.
My BFF. I wasn't going to get out of here without him. Okay, so in 2010, Jonathan Franzen's novel Freedom was published, and it was instantly hailed as a literary masterpiece. And the New York Times wrote 2 reviews of it, one of which was published like a week before the book came out. It was on the front page of the book review, and they wrote this huge, long profile of him, which was followed by another story about the response to the profile of him. Okay? So that cumulatively, it was like 3,000 or 4,000 words on this one guy and this one book. And I was part of a conversation on Twitter among women writers and women editors and women readers about why is it always a white guy? Why is it always this kind of book, this kind of writer? And one of my friends, Lizzie Skurnick, who she used to write the column for the Times Magazine called There Should Be a Word for That. I don't know if you guys remember, but like my big contribution was betrayal, B-I-T-R-A-Y-A-L, which is the feeling you get when you bite into something that you believe is going to be a chocolate chip and it's a fucking raisin. Betrayal, get it, right? So she said, like, what is the word for the feeling of watching, like, another white guy get all the ink? And I said, Franzenfreude, right? Which I learned was wrong. Like, Freude is the joy part, so it actually meant joy of Franzen. Not what I had meant to say, but I said, like, there's a real problem here because it's always a man. Whenever the Times does the daily review, the Sunday review, and the profile, it's always a man, okay? And I had read the Times pretty carefully. I'd been a published author for 9 years at that point. I'd been paying attention, yo. But what people said to me and to Jodi Picoult, who was the other author who was vocal about it, they said, you are wrong, you are lying, you are jealous, you are bitter, you are hysterical, your books suck, and that's why the Times won't review them. Your books don't deserve any attention, that's why you're not getting any, and you're bitter, and you're ugly, and Jonathan Franzen is way better than you are. Jonathan Franzen's editor actually said that in an interview. Like, you know, Jennifer Weiner's not a good writer, and that's why she gets ignored. Now, you can, you know, I do not claim to be Jonathan Franzen, although I will say that Shelf Awareness called this book a great American novel, and my mom didn't write that review, someone else did. You know, but I also know that men who write the same kind of books I do, kind of breezy, funny, but with substance and with heart, you know, single people in the city figuring out their lives. No one calls those books chick lit or dick lit, right? They're just books, right? And so I started talking about this, and Jodi started talking about this, and the response was vicious, and people tried to shut us up, and just it was horrible. But we knew we were right. And what happened next was someone actually counted. They counted how many reviews, how many New York Times reviewed books by women, how many books by men, how many reviews were written by women, how many reviews were written by men, how many men got the 2 reviews in a profile, the hat trick, how many women got it. And it turns out, lo and behold, there was a big discrepancy. I think it was like 60-40, which was actually one of the better counts, because the year after that, that was the first time VITA, this organization VITA, Organization of Women in the Arts, they counted not just the New York Times, they counted the New Yorker, the New Republic, Harper's, the Atlantic, the Paris Review, the London Review of Books, all of the big newspapers and magazines. Not one of them was 50-50. The Times was probably the best. The first year that VITA counted, the New Republic, I will never forget, they had reviewed 18 books by men and one book by a woman, okay? So, of course, when this count came out, editors were called on the carpet to explain their ratios. And some of them said, we have a problem here. And we have a problem in terms of the masthead and who is making the decisions about what books we're going to review, and we're going to look at this really seriously, and we're going to try to do better. There were publications where the editor said, we are just reviewing the best books, and if all the best books are by men, then so be it. Some of these editors who were saying stuff like that are no longer editors. A couple of them got Me Too'd. They are gone. You know, and it turns out, surprise, surprise, that the publications that had the worst ratios also had the editors who were macking on the interns, or who were saying, like, I'll publish you if you sleep with me, to young, aspiring writers. It was bad, and it was real, right? And we talked before about like when you name a problem, you can start to solve it. I think that once these counts came out and people could see like these pie charts, like they were graphic and they were undeniable, and you couldn't say, oh, that's just Jennifer Weiner being bitter and jealous and trying to promote her own work and using feminism as a vehicle to do it, as Jonathan Franzen said in an interview to The Guardian in 2014. Fucker ruined my Valentine's Day. He gave the interview like February 13th, and it was just like, you know, Jennifer Weiner, you know, she calls herself a feminist, but really she just wants to promote her own work. And I was just like, you are the fucking worst internet boyfriend ever. Like, why are you doing this to me on Valentine's Day? But, I mean, it was a real problem, and it has gotten better. The New York Times Book Review is now edited by a woman, right? The numbers have improved. They are reviewing romance, which they never did for years. They just ignored it. They reviewed mysteries, thrillers, horror, science fiction, Stephen King, Dan Brown, all those guys. They wouldn't touch mystery, which is by far the best-selling and most profitable genre in all of literature. They ignored it, and they don't ignore it anymore. And some of these publications have different editors, and it's getting better. But I think it has to do with, like, you asked about like how, you know, rating men's books and women's books. And I think that it goes back to like high school, right? Think about who you read in high school, right? Hemingway, Faulkner, F. Scott Fitzgerald, you know, and maybe you got Virginia Woolf, or maybe you got, you know, Jane Austen. But mostly it was men. It was men, men, men. And then if you were an English major in college, like I was, oh, guess what? More men. Men, men, men. And so I think that that shapes our consideration. And so then you're out in the world, and like maybe you're editing a magazine, or you're an intern at a magazine, and it's like, okay, who are we going to review? You know, and a lot of it has to do with packaging and marketing and how publishers sell their books, and like, you know, whether they decide to present something as literary versus presenting it as commercial. Like, I remember when I was trying to sell Good in Bed, and like somebody asked, like before I went to meet with publishers, like, okay, Jen, if they ask if you are literary or commercial, say commercial, because that's what sells, right? They want commercial. But I mean, I think that we have a long way to go in terms of like, who are we esteeming? Who's winning prizes? Who's getting published? Who's getting covered when they're published? Who's getting taken seriously versus who's getting slapped with a pink cover with naked legs on it and, you know, put in the summer read table? I think it's getting better, but I think that it's slow, but I think that awareness is helping. And, you know, in the worst of it, like when it felt like every single day someone was publishing a "let's give Jennifer Weiner the coverage she deserves" kind of article, and like basically Jennifer Weiner's books are all crap. Salon again, thanks. But, you know, when that was going on, I was just like, this feels terrible. Like, I mean, it wasn't, it felt so demeaning and so hurtful and so awful. But I would think, like, I'm going to die someday. And do I want my obituary to say, you know, Jennifer Weiner, best-selling author of blah, blah, blah novels? Or do I want it to say, Jennifer Weiner, best-selling author who was vocal in the quest to get more coverage for women writers? And I decided it's the second thing. And even if this hurts, and even if this feels like crap. So, thanks. Yeah. Thank you. Because I think it is getting better.
Do you know if any publisher is doing what they're doing with the symphonies now, which is blind auditions?
That is such an interesting question. I mean, I certainly can tell you that women have submitted things under male pseudonyms and gotten real different responses. You know, like there was a couple of years ago, a woman wrote a novel. She submitted it to agents, you know, the same query letter, the same agents. Some of it was signed with her name. Some of it was signed by a male name. As her, she got 3 requests to see the entire manuscript. As a guy, she got like 20. So I don't know that publishers are there yet, but I mean, it's, you know, quality is quality, right? And it shouldn't matter who wrote it any more than it should matter, than the gender of a conductor should matter. But I don't think they're there yet.
We have another question?
Hi. I was wondering, in the time since you wrote your first book, whether, how long ago was that?
2001,
2001.
my first book. Yeah.
So I was wondering, in that time period, whether you felt like you were able to talk about feminism now in a different way than you were then, and whether the culture has allowed you to kind of be more explicit and say, here's the problem and it is patriarchy, rather than, the kind of hedging around it that I know that I used to do.
I feel like I was always able to sort of have it there as subtext. And the thing about writing fiction is, like, I don't ever want to feel like I'm writing, like, polemics or, like, message books. Like, I want them to be entertaining. I want them to be compelling. I want the characters to feel vivid and real and relatable. If I'm going to, like, whomp you over the head with my political opinions, I'll do that in an op-ed for, like, 1,200 words and not, in a 400-page novel. But I've been lucky, because I think that even when they were calling my books chick lit, I could talk about feminism and patriarchy and weight and body image and capitalism and all of the people that make money from keeping women unhappy and in their bodies and in their skin and all that stuff. So publishing's run by women. I mean, that's the good news, So you can pretty much go there in your books. At least that's what I found. Hi.
Hi. Thank you so much for all the ways that you speak out for women. And I'm really curious. So I write books that I call feminist heist novels, but then the industry refers to them as urban women's fiction.
Oh, Lord.
And so I'm curious, because I've read your work over the years. How are you feeling about these labels these days? Chick lit, of course, is more out of fashion, but people talk about women's fiction.
Right.
What is your label thinking these days?
I mean, well, first of all, it's like I railed against chick lit for so long, and now that I'm 49, I'm just like, oh, would someone please call me a chick again? But no, but I joke that, like, I've aged out of chick lit and into the, from one ghetto to another. Now I'm in women's fiction, whatever the hell that is. There is no men's fiction, you might notice. God, but urban literature is like, that's a whole nother mess, right? And bookstores with African-American sections is a whole nother mess, because you've got Colson Whitehead next to Terry McMillan, next to Alyssa Cole, next to, writers who have absolutely nothing in common but the color of their skin. They don't belong on that table altogether. And yet, that is where publishing puts them in order to sell. So I long for the day when a book can be a book can be a book. And it's not women's fiction, it's not urban fiction, it's just a book. And I don't know what it's going to take to get there. I mean, I aged out of chick lit and into women's fiction. I also aged out of watching chick lit be everybody's scapegoat to YA being the stuff that everybody hated and mocked and made fun of people for reading. I think that we should all be able to read what we want. And I think that getting rid of some of these labels would help with that, because again, like, there's two competing things. Like, there's the right or the wrong of it, and then there's the how do we make money piece, where, I know that some publishers will defend the African-American section by saying, well, that's where readers know to go, and that sells books much better than just shelving them with, romance or with science fiction or with wherever they truly belong. And it's a complicated problem, because I think that as long as books exist for profit and have to be marketed and have to be sold in a few quick words, we're going to still have those categories. I don't know a way out of it. But life is long. Things could change. So, and now I want to read your books. Like Urban Heist, that's genius. I'm excited. We'll catch up later. All right, anybody else? Are we neglecting this side of the room? Does anyone here want to know anything? Get personal. It's the last night of tour. You can ask me anything. I'm so freaking punchy right now that, like, I'm surviving on, like, this can of chunky peanut butter that I bought 4 cities ago. Like, it's pathetic. I have no excuses. But.
Well, are there more questions? Raise your hand. Okay.
Yeah.
Have you always been this clear in your mission that you want to stand up for other women and you want to help other women raise their voices and be heard, or did this sort of have to come to you in a clarifying series of events?
I mean, I was a feminist. I was a feminist as a kid. Like, I I grew up in a household that took social justice seriously, and I think like the Jewish piece of it was part of that. Like, you know, I think that when you come from a generation, like my parents, their parents had lost relatives in the Holocaust, and so it was like, if you see something, say something. If you see injustice, you don't look away. It's your job to speak up. It's your job to try to fix it to the extent that you can. If you have privilege, it's your job to use that privilege to make things better for people who don't have as much privilege. So when I was picking a college, like, I always wanted to go to Smith. And I wanted to go to Smith because Gloria Steinem went to Smith. And I wanted to be Gloria Steinem when I grew up. Like, I truly did. And I visited the campus, and I loved it, and I applied, and I got in early. And then I'm like, okay, but wait. If I go to Smith, I'm going to be surrounded by a lot of people who think like I think and who believe what I believe, and I'm going to be in a place that is basically paradise for women. Like, there are no problems there to be solved. Like, there's nothing to push against, because Smith's mission was to educate women. And I got into Princeton. And Princeton was the last of the Ivies to go co-ed. Princeton had all-male eating clubs. Eating clubs are what Princeton's versions of fraternities and sororities are. It's where you go to like eat your meals. You don't live there, but you eat all your meals there, and it's where you socialize, and some classes met at the eating clubs. And there were all-male eating clubs. And Princeton's culture was very different than Smith's was. I mean, there was a vibrant and vocal and surprisingly and mysteriously well-funded conservative contingent, you know, who it turns out they were getting, there were foundations that were funneling money to like the Dartmouth Review and like the Princeton Sentinel. That was our conservative paper. And I figure, if I go to Smith, I'll learn how to write, I'll learn how to argue, I'll learn how to reason. But if I go to Princeton, I'll learn how to fight. And I wanted to fight, you know? I saw things wrong all around me. I saw injustice, I saw unfairness. And, you know, for a while I wanted to go into politics. But then I thought I would write speeches for a politician, because Susan Isaacs, the other person I wanted to be when I grew up, was a speechwriter at first, before she wrote fiction. But then I realized that if you want to say something to lots of people, you put it in a novel. You put it in a best-selling novel, because novels don't look real radical, you know, especially novels like mine. You know, you put it in fiction that is entertaining and it looks lighthearted, and oh, won't this be a jolly romp to take to the beach with me? And then it's like, holy shit, the fat girl just got a happy ending and didn't get a makeover. What did I just read? What even is this, you know? Like, I mean, my mom is still like, when I published my first book, the little local newspaper did a profile of me. And they called my mom up, and they're like, did you always know your daughter was talented? And Fran's like, no. She's like, no, I didn't. And they're like, did you always think she'd be a writer? And my mom said, I thought she'd be an academic, right? Like, my mom still is sort of like, I just thought you'd be a professor. And I'm like, but if you want to say something so a lot of people hear it, that's when you write a novel. That's when you sort of take all of the messages and the truths that you want to convey and the hard-won wisdom and all of your wishes for the future and for your daughters and for everyone's daughters, and you put them in fiction. And if they call it a beach read, that is okay. That all that means is that some more people are going to get radicalized at the beach. So,
fists in the air. All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for coming out tonight.
So great. And I'm going to sign everybody's books after I take a moment to freshen up. Is that the deal? Okay.
You look amazing. You don't need to do that. All right. Thank you to Women Lit and the Bay Area Book Festival.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Jennifer Weiner.
Yay.